There is a paradox at the heart of human experience. We chase pleasure, thinking it will satisfy us. Yet the more we feed the body's cravings, the less we hear the quiet murmur of our true self. Abstinence, whether from food, desire, or distraction, is not punishment. It is an invitation to enter a sacred space within, where our soul has been waiting patiently to be heard. In the end, abstinence is not about denial for its own sake, nor is it a rejection of the body or the beauty of the material world. It is a conscious choice to quiet the clamor of impulse, so we might hear the subtle voice of the soul. It is a path of discipline that unveils our hidden desires, a courageous confrontation with our shadows, a fertile silence in which old identities die and a truer self is reborn. By choosing authenticity over indulgence, we remember that we are not prisoners of craving, but beings capable of profound freedom. When the body goes silent, the soul finally speaks, and what it says is the truth we have been seeking all along, that we are more than our appetites, more than our fears, more than the masks we wear. We are luminous, resilient, and endlessly capable of renewal. May we have the courage to enter the silence, to meet ourselves honestly, and to live from the deepest part of who we are. For in that choice, we find not only our own liberation, but the power to bring light and healing into a world that desperately needs both. There is a tension at the heart of human life, the pull between indulging every impulse in the hope of feeling alive and the quiet, courageous path of living in alignment with our truest selves. Indulgence promises quick relief, fleeting thrills, and the illusion of freedom. Authenticity, by contrast, demands honesty, patience, and a willingness to stand alone. Yet only through authenticity do we find a life that feels real, meaningful, and unshakable. Abstinence, when chosen not from fear but from a longing for truth, becomes the crucible in which this authenticity is forged. In a world that constantly urges us to consume more, flaunt more, and gratify ourselves at every turn, it is easy to mistake indulgence for self-expression. We are told that buying what we desire, saying whatever we think, or pursuing pleasure without limit is the essence of being true to ourselves. But this is a shallow parody of authenticity. The self that seeks endless indulgence is often not our deepest self at all, but a collection of insecurities, conditioned responses, and borrowed dreams. When we indulge every craving, we rarely discover who we are. We only reinforce who we have been told to be. Choosing authenticity over indulgence begins with the courage to pause. When we abstain from our usual distractions, we start to hear the faint but unmistakable voice of our own conscience. This voice does not speak in the language of fear or guilt. It asks simple, piercing questions. What do I truly value? Who am I trying to impress? Does this action reflect who I want to become? By sitting with these questions instead of rushing to the next comfort, we begin to separate what feels good momentarily from what feels right deeply. Abstinence sharpens our awareness of the gap between our actions and our ideals. It shows us how often we betray our own integrity for the sake of fitting in or avoiding discomfort. Perhaps we gossip to feel included, spend beyond our means to seem important, or pretend to agree to avoid conflict. Each small indulgence of inauthenticity erodes our sense of self. But when we choose to restrain these impulses, to speak the truth even when it costs us, or to honor our boundaries even when it disappoints others, we grow in authenticity, a solid, quiet strength that indulgence can never give. Authenticity brings peace because it ends the exhausting performance of trying to be what we think others want. It frees us from the burden of maintaining masks and half-truths. It allows us to meet life with an open heart, unafraid of being seen for who we really are. This does not mean we become rigid or self-righteous. It means we remain rooted in our values, even as we adapt to changing circumstances. Authenticity is not a fixed identity, but a commitment to live each moment in alignment with our evolving truth. Indulgence may offer temporary pleasure, but authenticity brings lasting fulfillment. It is the difference between feeling entertained and feeling alive, between numbing our pain and finding meaning in our struggles. Through authenticity, we learn to value depth over appearance, connection over approval, and purpose over comfort. We become able to face our failures without shame because we know they do not define us. They are simply part of our journey toward becoming more fully ourselves. Choosing authenticity over indulgence is an act of love for ourselves and for the world. It allows us to give our true gifts, unfiltered by the need to impress or conform. It enables us to form relationships built on trust and mutual respect, rather than manipulation or pretense. It inspires others to seek their own truth, for there is nothing more magnetic than a person who lives from the inside out. And it brings us into harmony with life itself, which always favors what is real over what is merely expedient. Through the discipline of abstinence, we remember that what we sacrifice are only the illusions that keep us small. What we gain is the freedom to stand firmly in our authenticity, a state of being that is unbending yet compassionate, honest yet humble, fierce yet kind. In this space, life becomes not a series of indulgences to chase, but a sacred opportunity to express who we truly are, moment by moment, breath by breath. Every cycle of life, from the smallest seed to the grandest star, moves through death and rebirth. So too does the human soul. But while nature follows these rhythms instinctively, we resist them. We cling to the familiar, fearing the surrender of what we know, even if it has long ceased to nourish us. Yet in moments of chosen restraint, when we consciously deny ourselves what once defined us, we enter an inner death that makes possible the miracle of rebirth. In abstaining from what numbs or controls us, we let old identities and illusions fall away so that something truer can be born. Restraint feels like dying because it demands we let go of the comforts and compulsions that have become part of our identity. Whether we abstain from substances, unhealthy relationships, or the constant need for approval, we face an emptiness that terrifies us. It can feel like stepping into a void, unsure if anything lies on the other side. Yet it is precisely this void that becomes the fertile ground for transformation. Without it, the soul remains crowded with yesterday's debris, and nothing new can take root. In this emptiness, we confront our attachments. We see how our sense of self has become entangled with habits that keep us stagnant. We notice how we have used pleasure as an anesthetic, busyness as a disguise, or others' praise as a substitute for self-worth. As we restrain ourselves from these patterns, we are stripped down to a raw, honest state. It is not comfortable. We feel exposed, vulnerable, and often lost. But this vulnerable space is sacred. It is the place where illusions die, so the soul can remember what it was before it became imprisoned by habit and fear. Restraint reveals to us the difference between want and need. We begin to discern what is essential for our growth from what only sustains our ego. A life spent chasing every fleeting want leaves us scattered, restless, and shallow. A life shaped by understanding our true needs leads us toward depth, purpose, and peace. By practicing restraint, we stop pouring our energy into endless appetites and start directing it toward building a self aligned with our highest values. In this process, something extraordinary begins to unfold. As old cravings lose their power, we discover new sources of joy, the quiet satisfaction of living in integrity, the profound beauty of simple moments, the strength found in self-mastery. These are joys we could not perceive while we were enslaved by our impulses. They are signs that rebirth has begun, that a wiser, freer self is emerging from the ashes of what no longer serves us. Rebirth through restraint is not an abstract idea, but a living experience. Each day we choose to abstain from what diminishes us, we are reborn a little more into our true nature. This is not about punishing the body or denying life's pleasures, but about awakening to the possibility that the most profound pleasures arise when we are not controlled by them. When we are no longer driven by fear or compulsion, we find ourselves able to act from love, clarity, and courage. There is immense power in restraint because it reconnects us with our own agency. It reminds us that we are not victims of desire, but beings capable of choice. Each act of conscious self-denial is a declaration of freedom. I am not what I crave. I am not what I fear losing. I am something deeper, stronger, and more resilient than I ever imagined. In this realization, the soul expands. What dies is only the shell of who we thought we had to be. What is born is the self we were meant to become. Rebirth through restraint does not promise a life without struggle. It promises a life in which struggle leads to growth, where each descent into silence and discipline is followed by a rising into greater wholeness. It is through these cycles of letting go and beginning anew that we remember the soul's timeless truth. We are not fixed beings but ever-evolving mysteries, capable of endless renewal. There is a hidden realm within every human being, a place where unacknowledged fears, rejected impulses, and denied truths gather like shadows at dusk. This realm is not evil in itself, yet it is the birthplace of much suffering because we refuse to face it. When we choose abstinence and silence, we enter a confrontation that most spend their lives avoiding, the battle between our conscious self, who we believe we are, and our shadow, all the parts we wish we were not. It is here, in this encounter, that abstinence reveals its most powerful truth. What we resist will rule us, and only by seeing it clearly can we reclaim our freedom. The shadow begins to stir the moment we stop numbing ourselves with pleasure or distraction. Suddenly, buried memories bubble up. Old shames knock at the door. Hidden resentments whisper in the quiet. We may feel surprised by the anger, envy, or despair that arises when we fast from our usual comforts. We think these dark feelings are a sign of failure, but in reality they are signs of the shadow making itself known. The more we have ignored or suppressed these parts of ourselves, the more fiercely they erupt when silence creates space for them to speak. This inner battle can feel overwhelming because the shadow is cunning. It wears many disguises: self-pity, superiority, cynicism, or even false piety. It tells us stories of our inadequacy or tempts us to judge others so we do not look within. It insists that discomfort is a danger to flee rather than a doorway to truth. Without awareness, we become puppets of these hidden forces, repeating patterns of behavior we claim to hate, sabotaging what we most want, or harming others in the name of protecting ourselves. But abstinence, the conscious choice to withhold from easy relief, gives us the chance to stand still long enough to see these patterns for what they are. When we refrain from our habitual escapes, the shadow has nowhere to hide. We begin to notice how our anger often masks fear, how our arrogance covers insecurity, or how our compulsions are fueled by old wounds we have never healed. These realizations can feel like a battle because they threaten the identity we have carefully constructed to survive in the world. The ego resists, afraid that if we acknowledge the shadow, we will be swallowed by it. Yet it is not the shadow that destroys us, but our refusal to face it. By observing the darkness within without flinching, we begin to integrate it. We see that every part of the shadow has something to teach us. Anger can reveal where we have been violated. Envy can show us what we secretly yearn for. Fear can point to what matters most. Instead of rejecting these emotions, we can work with them, transforming them from forces of sabotage into guides toward greater wholeness. This inner battle is not a war to win by annihilating the shadow, for the shadow is part of us. It is a lifelong process of befriending our darkness so we can choose consciously rather than act unconsciously. The goal is not perfection, but integration, a unity of self, where we acknowledge our contradictions and use them as sources of wisdom and compassion. Only then do we stop projecting our disowned traits onto others, freeing ourselves from cycles of blame and conflict. As we practice abstinence and allow silence to reveal the shadow, we grow stronger and more honest. We come to realize that light and dark are both necessary to our humanity. We find humility in seeing our flaws and strength in knowing we are more than our worst moments. The battle of shadow and self does not end with one victory, but each time we face our inner darkness with courage, we reclaim a bit more of our soul's power and take one step closer to living as whole, conscious beings. Discipline is a word that often evokes resistance. It conjures images of rigidity, deprivation, and cold self-control. Yet true discipline is not about punishing the self. It is a compassionate act of turning inward to see clearly what drives us. When we practice discipline through abstinence, by holding back from instant gratification, by choosing to pause before we act, by refraining from the comforts that sedate us, we begin to unearth the tangled roots of our desires. These roots, hidden beneath layers of habit and impulse, reveal what we are really seeking beneath our cravings. At first, discipline feels like a wall. The body and mind rage against restraint, desperate to slip back into the ease of automatic indulgence. We find ourselves reaching for what we have sworn off, our thoughts circling temptations like moths to a flame. But if we stay with the discomfort instead of fleeing from it, discipline becomes a mirror. We start to observe our cravings without immediately obeying them, and we notice what triggers them. The boredom that sends us scrolling endlessly, the loneliness that drives us toward unhealthy relationships, the unacknowledged fear that fuels our pursuit of status or power. In this space of conscious observation, we can ask, what do these desires conceal? Why do we feel empty when external pleasures are taken away? Such questions cannot be answered by the intellect alone. They require the embodied awareness that comes from sitting with ourselves when there is nothing to distract us. Discipline teaches us patience with our own restlessness. It invites us to peel back layer after layer until we touch the original wound or longing that set our compulsions in motion. Perhaps we find that our hunger for approval masks an old wound of rejection. Perhaps our constant busyness covers an anxiety about being unworthy if we are not producing. Perhaps our search for pleasure is a way to numb a grief we have not allowed ourselves to feel. Through discipline, we do not banish these discoveries. We welcome them as lost parts of ourselves asking what they need, rather than how we can silence them. In this way, discipline becomes an act of radical self-compassion, shining light on the roots of desire, so we can begin to heal them. Without discipline, we remain at the mercy of every passing urge. We mistake momentary cravings for our deepest needs and wonder why satisfaction is so fleeting. We become trapped in cycles of indulgence and regret, never understanding what truly drives us. But with discipline, we cultivate the freedom to choose. We learn that we do not have to obey every impulse. We discover a space between stimulus and response, a place where our awareness can intervene and guide us toward choices aligned with our true values. This freedom does not make us ascetics or coldly detached. It allows us to engage with life more fully. We can savor pleasure without being enslaved by it. We can set healthy boundaries without fear of missing out. We can pursue our dreams without confusing them with the expectations of others. Discipline gives us the clarity to know which desires lead us closer to who we want to become and which temptations only lead us in circles. Through the practice of discipline, we also find that our desires themselves transform. As we stop feeding shallow compulsions, deeper and more authentic longings rise to the surface. We begin to crave connection over conquest, meaning over distraction, contribution over consumption. We learn to desire experiences that nourish the soul rather than merely stimulate the senses. And in this shift, we discover that discipline is not the enemy of desire, but its greatest ally, a path that helps us discern what our heart truly seeks beneath the noise of fleeting wants. There is a voice that speaks to each of us, but few ever truly hear it. It does not thunder from the skies, nor does it rise from the roar of our busy days. It waits in the quiet spaces within, murmuring softly beneath the tides of thought and the waves of feeling. This is the hidden voice of the soul, the part of us untouched by the fleeting cravings of the body or the shifting demands of the world. Yet for most of our lives, we drown it out with endless noise, convinced that the louder, more immediate voices of appetite and anxiety are the only truths worth heeding. When we enter the practice of abstinence, whether from indulgent habits, impulsive speech, or mindless consumption, we begin to clear the layers of static that keep this inner voice buried. The initial days of abstaining are often marked by frustration and restlessness. We feel as though something vital has been taken from us, as if we are being punished. But with time, a subtle shift occurs. We begin to realize that it was not the absence of external pleasures that made us uncomfortable, but the sudden exposure of our own unacknowledged inner world. As the turbulence of unmet desires settles, we catch glimpses of this hidden voice. It appears in flashes of insight we could not have forced. It stirs as a feeling of resonance when we contemplate certain choices or paths. It emerges as an unshakable sense of right or wrong, or an instinctive knowing of what brings us closer to our authentic selves. This voice does not argue or shout. It does not repeat the judgments of others or the shoulds of our culture. It speaks simply and with profound honesty. One of the great tragedies of modern life is that we mistake the loudest voices, the marketing that tells us what to buy, the influencers who tell us how to live, the opinions of peers who tell us who to be, for our own. In chasing these voices, we forget the quiet wisdom within. Abstinence cuts through this confusion by creating intentional space for listening. When we fast from the world's opinions, we start to remember what our soul has always known. Hearing the hidden voice requires courage. It often tells us things we would rather avoid, that we are not truly fulfilled by the paths we have chosen, that we are staying in places that deaden our spirit, or that we are betraying our gifts in pursuit of approval. It can be painful to face these truths, and many turn back to distraction rather than sit with the discomfort. But for those willing to remain in that vulnerable silence, the hidden voice grows clearer and more insistent. It becomes a trustworthy guide, one that never demands perfection but always points us toward what is honest and life-giving. This voice also reveals our deeper needs, not just for comfort or success, but for connection, meaning, and the courage to create. It speaks of the longing to be seen without masks, to give love without bartering for it, to risk the unknown in service of something larger than ourselves. These yearnings cannot be satisfied by quick pleasures. They require patience, reflection, and the willingness to let go of what no longer serves us. As we learn to recognize the hidden voice, we discover that it has always been there, quietly observing, softly encouraging, even as we ignored it. It knows both our wounds and our strengths, our darkest impulses and our highest aspirations. It carries a memory of who we were before we learned to fear ourselves, and a vision of who we can become when we return to our deepest truths. Listening to this voice is not a one-time event, but a lifelong practice. It asks us to keep returning to silence, to keep abstaining from what numbs us, so we can remain attuned to the guidance rising from within. And in hearing this voice, we find not only direction, but a profound sense of belonging to ourselves, to life, and to something timeless that calls us toward wholeness. There comes a moment in every human life when the clamor of existence becomes deafening. The endless demands of the body, the insistent chatter of the mind, the ceaseless push and pull of desire and fear. It is in these moments that many instinctively reach for more noise, more distractions, more indulgence, trying to outrun the discomfort rising from within. Yet paradoxically, it is precisely when we dare to stop feeding the noise that a hidden door begins to appear. This door is silence itself, not an empty void, but a threshold, a gateway to a realm we spend our lives ignoring. When we choose abstinence, we are not merely practicing discipline or restraint, we are preparing ourselves to cross that threshold. The first experience of silence that follows the cessation of our habitual pleasures can feel like a storm. The mind grows restless, memories surge, regrets and anxieties rise to the surface. It feels as if the chaos has multiplied. But this is only because we are, for the first time, witnessing the true state of our inner world, unmasked by distractions. In the silence of abstinence, the unconscious begins to speak in its native language. Images, feelings, sudden insights, and what was hidden starts to reveal itself. Silence strips away illusions. When the cravings of the body go unfulfilled, we quickly see how many of our so-called needs are simply learned patterns, conditioned responses to discomfort. Our hunger to always be entertained, to be validated, to be numbed by pleasure, these are not essential truths, but veils keeping us from recognizing our deeper longings. The gateway of silence shows us that the body's restless appetites can overshadow the quieter, more enduring desires of the soul, to love without control, to create without fear of failure, to belong without surrendering our authenticity. In silence, we also encounter the timelessness of our own being. The ticking clock of tasks and obligations falls away. We notice details long missed, the quality of light through a window, the sound of our own breath, the subtle shift of thoughts drifting in and out. What initially feels empty begins to feel full. In this space, we remember we are not merely a body that eats, works, and sleeps, but a soul capable of wonder. We remember we were born not to perform endlessly, but to experience life with presence. Many avoid silence because it threatens the fragile self-image we spend our lives constructing. Without noise, we can no longer pretend to be what we are not. The stories we tell ourselves of being too important to pause, too broken to heal, or too busy to care, begin to dissolve. And what stands revealed is a truer self, vulnerable yet resilient, incomplete yet capable of growth. This encounter is both terrifying and liberating, for it is in silence that we realize the only way forward is through honesty with ourselves. Abstinence, then, is not an end but an initiation. It invites us into silence, and silence invites us into truth. As the body's demands fall quiet, we cross the threshold to a realm where the soul finally has room to breathe. Here we find not the dead stillness of an empty room, but the living silence of a sacred space, a silence that listens as much as it speaks, that holds our questions without rushing to answer, that teaches us that meaning is born not from noise, but from the quiet between our words. The gateway of silence opens only to those who are willing to endure discomfort, who can resist the siren's song of easy satisfaction long enough to step into the unknown. But for those who enter, the reward is profound. The discovery that beyond the tumult of craving lies a peace that does not depend on circumstance, and a wisdom that does not shout but patiently waits, always ready to guide us back to ourselves.